I'm really happy that you're all here with us this evening. My name is Trevor Wynn. I'm the Community Services Manager at Oak Park Public Library. I appreciate all of you being here today. I want to thank you for joining us this evening and for our conversation with Tracy and with Ken. A special welcome to the mayor, to members of the library's board of trustees, to our friends of the library group who changed the meeting in order for them to be able to join us. And so I appreciate that. I want to also recognize Colleen and her colleague from BookBeat. She is our co-sponsor for this event, and she is the one who brought this to my attention. So this event is really all due to Colleen. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Colleen. So, raised in rural Michigan, Detroit and Brooklyn-based writer Tracy McMillan has written for publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Mother Jones, Harper's Magazine, Slate, and even National Geographic. After putting herself through NYU and training under legendary reporter Wayne Barrett, she was the managing editor of the award-winning magazine City Limits from 2001 to 2005, a one-time target of Rush Limbaugh and a 2012 to 2013 Knight Wallace Journalism Fellow. McMillan is also the author of the best-selling The American Way of Eating, which was published in 2012 and was a New York Times bestseller. McMillan's work has been recognized by the Sidney Hillman Book Prize, the James Beard Foundation, Journalism Awards, and investigative reporters and editors, among others. So it is a pleasure to have her in Oak Park. Tracy is joined this evening by Ken Coleman. Ken is a veteran reporter and author himself and currently writes for the Michigan Advance. And he focuses on Southeast Michigan history and civil rights. He is a former Michigan Chronicle senior editor and served as the American Black Journal segment host on Detroit Public Television. Ken has also written and published 4 books on Black life in Detroit, a prolific author himself. Please join me in welcoming both of them back to Oak Park.
I am so proud to be the conversation host or moderator today. Tracy and I don't know each other personally. We've kind of met each other through social media over the weeks and months, particularly when we began to help to promote this event. But I'm very proud of the work that she has done and continues to do. And she will talk a little bit about, in my opening question, she'll talk a little bit about her family's history here in Michigan. But to be sure, she is an Oak Parker, so give her a hand.
For 4 years.
For 4 years, but nonetheless. And so as folk are continuing to come in, please come in and make yourself seated. We're just getting started. Part of what we'll do today, I'll have a series of questions for Tracy to help talk about the white bonus, help to talk about her journey as a journalist, as a Michigander, as someone who cares a lot about the space in which we all live. And we'll also talk about, and I think this is one of the, at least in my mind, as an African American from Detroit who lives 3 miles south of here in one direction and grew up 4 miles from here in another direction. At age 56 now, I know a lot about our history in southeastern Michigan. We'll talk a little bit about that and why Tracy believes, and certainly points out successfully in the white bonus, that this conversation with whites and blacks, other people of color, is so very important in the world in which we live, certainly in the nation in which we live. We'll have that conversation. So, Tracy, let's get right into it, right?
All right.
Talk to me about your parents' history, your grandparents' history, as it relates to Michigan. What was it that caused you to become an Oak Parker for the years you were here, and this sort of southern Oakland County, southeastern Michigan existence?
Sure. So thank you again so much, Ken and Trevor and Colleen and all the folks who made this possible. For me, it's really special to get to be here in Oak Park because, so those 4 years would be 0 to 4 in terms of age. So I don't really remember much outside of what I've seen in family photo albums of living in Oak Park. So for me, I had to kind of excavate that history both through to the extent that shoeboxes with random documents and, photo albums are an archive, right? My family archive, and then public documentation, right? That I started digging into. For me, it's not so curious about why my parents moved here, right? They were newlyweds. My mom grew up in Pontiac. My dad grew up in Ann Arbor. They met at Eastern Michigan. And so they got a house in 1974 on the east side of Oak Park, which my grandfather, my dad's dad, loaned them interest-free, the down payment for that. So they move over to a house on Rensselaer. And for me, what was more interesting is why we ended up leaving, right? So in 1981, my parents moved from here up to Holly. So I grew up in Holly. So when I say I'm a rural Michigander, right, that's why. And, my whole recollection growing up was that we moved because of the schools. And so my father I have a recollection specifically when I was a teenager or maybe early college, my dad saying well, we had to move because of the schools. If we'd stayed in Oak Park, we would have had to pay for private school. And so I sort of internalized this as schools in Oak Park bad and schools in Holly good. So
why did he,
Yeah.
I'm going to interject.
Yes, of course.
And so,
Please do.
as an inquiring
because
journalist.
I will talk, so please.
I think I know the answer, but why did we have to move? Or why, if we stayed here, why would we have to go to private schools?
Right.
What was his concern at that point?
So I could not get my father to answer this because when I went back to him to interview him for this book, right? So I said, okay, I'm actually talking to you specifically about this. And in my father's defense, right, this is now some 45 years since that was happening, right? He's an older person now. He was like, I don't know anything. I don't think we really thought about the schools when we moved. I don't really remember anything about what was going on. Because actually, folks in the city might know the east side of Oak Park, part of those houses, including the one I had been brought home to, were zoned into Ferndale schools. Right, and so Ferndale schools were the district that we would have been going to. So I'm starting to poke around. So I don't know any of the history around here, right? So I just know Oak Park, Ferndale bad, Holly good, right? So, yeah.
That's part of that early experience. And
Yeah.
you're an adult. Well, not an adult.
But a
early
kid.
adolescent, a kid.
Yeah. So I don't understand at the time anything of the racial history of the region. I mean, very much. As a young person, I had a deeply instilled fear of Detroit. And as in if I go to Detroit and I get out of the car, somebody might snatch me, something bad will happen. That sort of level of antipathy and fear, right, which I don't believe was based on any there's no story in my family of we went to Detroit and had a bad time.
Sure.
Right.
But it was part of the oral sort of experience that you had.
Deeply ingrained, broad racism, where I grew up.
Yeah.
And so, but then when I started digging around, I learned that, the year that my family moved to Holly was the year that Ferndale integrated its elementary schools, right? I had never heard anything about this. I did not know that Ferndale was the first northern district to be sued by the federal government for operating a segregated district. So it was sort of used as an example. And that the district fought tooth and nail, just very periodically, the same way they did in the South, saying from 1969 when it was filed until 1981, the district gave up about $2 million in funding from the feds, right, rather than just go ahead and integrate the elementary school.
And it wasn't an uncommon experience, as many of you and the audience know, Ferndale's experience, 15 or 20 miles north in Pontiac. How many people remember Irene McCabe? Some of you might be of that age. Remember the bus bombings in Pontiac in 1971, where Robert Miles of the Ku Klux Klan and Howell and others bombed school buses, unoccupied school buses. But they were bombed in August of 1971 because there were people who did not want to see racially integrated classrooms in Pontiac. We certainly know of the experience in Detroit that same year, a class action suit filed by the Detroit NAACP against the Detroit Public Schools and the Detroit Public School District, African American led class action suit that charged that for many decades, and this is in 1971, many decades, the Detroit Public Schools, which was on its way, the city of Detroit, which was on its way to becoming a majority African American community, those men and women who are part of that class action suit charged that the city of Detroit was carrying out race discrimination, disparities in resources for schools. So even in a city that was becoming an African American city, nonetheless, a community like Ferndale or like Pontiac, the issue of schools, public schools, how they would be carried out, who would attend them, what were the resources would be a part of that, was not only an issue in southern Oakland County or in northern Oakland County for that matter, and obviously in Detroit was a big issue. And so what I've gleaned, Tracy, in the white bonus is that you sort of make the argument that this issue over education, this lack of or disparate carrying out of federal resources, the GI Bill and others, helped to build this inequity between whites and people of color. Talk to me about how the white bonus comes together. Why did you decide to write this book on this subject at this time?
Okay, so a useful frame of reference is people are like, so you pitched this after George Floyd? I'm like, no, I did not. This is something I suggested to publishers in 2019. And I probably would, because of sort of how the George Floyd stuff rippled through publishing around concerns about representation, I doubt I would have gotten a book deal, honestly.
And George Floyd, just
right.
for those that don't know, is the African American who was killed by law enforcement in Minneapolis in 2020.
2020. And so for me, honestly, I was just tired of stepping in it when I tried to talk about race and class at the same time. Like most, I live part-time in New York. I'm in sort of fairly elite journalism circles. And certainly and there's a bit of like a Brooklyn bubble. And so I would be talking to people and they would talk about white privilege and they would actually be talking about white privilege and class privilege. They'd be talking about wealthy white people.
Sure.
So you'll sort of hear colloquially things like, oh, well, white privilege is mommy and daddy paid for college and sent you to Europe for the summer. Well, my family didn't do that.
Working class family. Or
working
to some
the
extent.
middle, it depends on sort of where and how you're, compared to most of the people I work alongside in media, sure, working class. Compared to everybody else in the country, more stably middle class, depending,
Okay, sure.
however you want to
I appreciate that. I appreciate the clarity.
But, for me, I was like, well, I'm not rich, but I can tell, especially because the first book I worked undercover in 3 jobs, 2 of those workplaces, I was the only white person working in either place, so I really had time to think about how my race was affecting the way I was treated. And I was like, well, clearly stuff happens because I'm white. I don't actually know how to talk about this. And once you start talking about the privilege part, it gets real slippery,
Sure.
right? Because it's
course.
well, is it race privilege or class privilege or pretty privilege, what, all these privileges. So I was like, well, what if we just tried to quantify it? Because I've done work as a reporter where I came up with a way to measure food deserts and food access in the early aughts. And that then helped to build a movement where we now actually measure that as part of government policy. So I was like, well, maybe I can come up with a back of the envelope calculation. That's all that this stuff really is back of the envelope rough estimates of the amount of money an individual white person gets or saves because of white supremacy and policy and practice, right? So that would be stuff like, my parents pay for $3,000 of college for me. Well, how could they afford that? Well, they had some wealth in their house. How did they afford the house? Well, they afforded the house because they bought it with profits from the first house in Oak Park. How did they do that?
You build on it.
They got the down payment from Grandpa. How did Grandpa have that down payment? Oh, Grandpa, well, A, owned a house with a racial covenant, and B, worked as a banker and got into that industry at a time when there were 250,000 bankers across the whole country and only 80 were black, right?
Yeah.
So you sort of just keep peeling back. I'm like, okay, well, nobody handed me a check saying, like, you are white, so you get this. However, it seems really unlikely that my parents or my grandfather, for that matter, would have had any money to help me out
If not
for being white.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things, as I pointed out earlier, I have a few questions, but I'm out of the African American Baptist tradition, and we believe in call and response. And so we don't lecture to people. We have conversations, and I dig all of your nods and your interest. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to have a few questions, but we're going to leave plenty of time for you to have any reactions to what we heard or any specific questions for Tracy. So you've given us a sort of background of your family. And I want to get more into the book. One of the things that I find fascinating is, and I don't think I've ever seen, and I think the sort of ingenuitive from a journalistic standpoint that I think that makes this book so special is you've made an attempt to quantify in dollars what white privilege, if you accept that term, what white privilege means as opposed to someone who is not white. The advantages that you have economically, you spoke to it a little bit, but talk to me about the formula, if you will, about identifying 5 families, including yours, and doing that calculation of how those families have benefited from white privilege as opposed to maybe some families that look like me and other people in the audience. How did you come up with that?
I mean, I just started to be like, well, how would I measure what I've gotten? What seems like a reasonable and fair thing to do? I will say this makes economists and social scientists real anxious, right? Because they talk a lot about counterfactuals, right? Like they want me to find like me but black and prove that I got more, and that is beyond my capacity, right? But I was like, well, how much money did I get from my family since I turned 18 or left home is like part of the bonus, right? So I just sort of tally up like money for college, interest-free loans. When my grandpa died, I got a small inheritance. Like later, I got a little more from my parents, like so on and so forth. So when you adjust that for inflation in the last 30 years, it comes to like $142,000, right? And I will say it has not felt like that much, right? None of the money that has come has been so significant that it fundamentally shifted.
Well, adjusted for inflation, that's a pretty big sum of dough in the first place, but.
Yeah, it was more like 70 in real dollars at each time.
Very good.
But then by the time, whatever.
Sure.
Right? And then you also have, looking at what are some of the sort of fundamental financial arrangements in my life. So like, what's my housing like? And my jobs, housing and jobs being the main thing. And is there any evidence to support the idea that I would have gotten a better wage or been given an apartment that was more affordable, things like that, because of my race, right? And as well as, I should say, I also include, for me at least, the benefit from racism sort of more broadly. And here I'm talking particularly about housing in Detroit being so cheap, right?
For many decades.
Right. Well, but particularly, right, I bought a house from the land bank there in 2015.
Yeah.
In fact, I believe one of the women who lives in it right now is here with me.
Okay. This is a couple years after the bankruptcy in 2013.
Right. So it was one of the early Detroit land bank. Yeah. I mean, the house is like a Victorian and a historic neighborhood. That was not livable. I had to renovate it, right? But the purchase price for the house was $27,000, and I had to put down $2,000, right? I would not have been able to buy a house in any other city. I mean, I could not even buy a parking spot in New York, right? No. So I'm able to do that, and in part because I'd lived in New York and had a sense
that
because
frame
I'd
of reference.
Well, and I'd lived through gentrification there, and in fact, unwittingly been an agent of it, right? Because I would be like the first person in a couple of the neighborhoods I moved, first white person in one of the neighborhoods that I moved to, that then would start signaling to people, right? Like, oh, you could bring other people in here, right? But so, for me, this social bonus, the things that I get once I'm out in the world, both includes the things individually, like when employers hire me, or this sort of thing where like racism made something super affordable and allowed me to build wealth in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise. And that comes to something like, I want to say it's over $200,000, right? Again, adjusted for inflation and things like that.
Of course. So you, the big part of the book is that you take your family along with 4 others.
Right.
And so how did you go about trying to find, or was there a thought around the other 4 families?
Yep.
What went into that mental conversation about who to pick,
Yep.
representative,
Great question.
all
Yep.
that?
So I wanted to make sure that I had sort of a broad geographic swath, right? Me and my family, particularly, if it's just a memoir, then anybody could sort of dismiss this and be like, well, that's just your
That's your
family,
story.
so who knows, right? I was like, well, I know how to do it with other people, right? When it was hard to find somebody, because sometimes it was hard to find a subject, I'd be like, I just need one person in this place that fits this basic profile, right? So I would come up with a general archetype. So in Pittsburgh, I was like, well, I think I'll go report in Pittsburgh, because that is a big Rust Belt city, but it's majority white, and is considered to have a successful economy. So it's different than Detroit, right, which I'm already covering. And I want to find somebody in like the service industry or part of that new economy that's emerging. Initially, I thought I'd find a restaurant worker. I ended up with a nurse, right, who by happenstance came from a construction trades family, right, which actually opened up a really interesting path into talking about unions and race in America and using that, right?
Sure.
Then I was like, well, I want to go to the Deep South. I'm a big fan of Kiese Lehman and Jesmyn Ward as writers, and would like an opportunity to spend more time in the place that gave us them. And so I'll find some white people who can help me explore school segregation in the South, right? So I ended up finding, ultimately deciding on working with a pair of sisters who went through the Hattiesburg, Mississippi public school system as it was resegregating at the turn of the 21st century, right?
Wow.
And then I had I actually knew somebody who agreed to be in the book who is a peer of mine, initially from New York. He lives in California now. But when he was 17, he went to high school and thought it would be a good idea to sell some acid out of his backpack. So he gets caught. And then when he comes back to school after the first arrest, the snitch, like he's mad at the snitch, so he like goes and kind of shakes him down for some money and sort of threatens him. So snitch snitches again, and he ends up with extortion and larceny charges and goes before a judge in 1994. It's a peak of punitive drug policing with selling narcotics on school grounds, extortion, and larceny, and he gets given a second chance.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And he's also, he's like, I don't think that would have happened except that I'm
I
white.
was white.
Right? And also then quantifying what were the expenses he avoided by not being incarcerated, right? Because there's so much I think of it as state profiteering tied to sort of like the criminal system, right? So you start paying fees, you got to pay for visitation, you got to pay for commissary, you got to pay for all this stuff.
Sure.
Right? And then the last story that I use is a woman that I found through her family. I knew her family so I knew I was looking to sort of do something in Texas about, or the Southwest was my thought, about sort of health policy. And so I ended up, somewhat through happenstance, a former colleague of mine, her sister had died because she didn't have health insurance in Texas, right? Which is a story about the lack of expansion of Medicaid, which is a story about race. And so provides a really interesting, because the framing of the book is about the bonus, but an important part that also surfaces, particularly through Barb's story in Texas, is that there are real serious costs to everybody, including a lot of white people, because of the way that white supremacy and racism contort our public policies and our public institutions. So there's cost to it as well, because that was a middle-class family. That was a very stable middle-class family. The woman who died, her sisters are all middle-class.
Sure.
But then they face this cost too.
Just a couple more questions before we turn it open to all of y'all and your attentive audience. I can tell you're chomping at the bit to interact directly with Tracy. I think the writer in me, and there might not be a lot of writers in here, but the writer in me has this burning question. How long did it take to write the project, to produce the project?
I had a general idea that I wanted to write about whiteness and class. That is literally how coherent it was in 2016 with the Trump election,
Yep, yep.
and particularly hillbilly elegy, because I was like, this book is not doing it.
Define that now, if you got it.
Oh,
that
sorry.
term.
So hillbilly elegy.
I think I know, and I
Right.
think maybe some of the
Well, it was
audience
a massive best-selling book in 2016 by J.D. Vance, who's now, not surprisingly, it turns out to be perhaps a bit opportunistic and not have a lot of, I don't like him. But this book that conservative media in particular embraced as this is why Trump is rising.
It
This
was a
is
cause celeb, maybe in. Or
well,
at
because
least
it was
the-
like,
the
here is a
business
story of
right?
white poverty that just, from my perspective, like, just really dug in on being like, let's figure out how to blame poor people for being poor and just make it acceptable to do it to white people, because we already do it to black people, so now we'll just do it. So just sort of like spread out being punitive to people more. So I was like, I don't really like that. I want to write about whiteness and class. It took me 3 years to come up with like the framing of the white bonus and be like, here's sort of how I would do it. And at that point, I only had one subject identified, like the criminal justice story. And then it took about another 4 years, including the pandemic.
through.
Right?
Yeah,
So the
well,
pandemic
obviously that-
hit like a year in, and then I was like, well, I can't go anywhere
Have
and
you
before.
considered trying to calculate his white privilege?
Oh, J.D. Vance?
That's the next.
I mean, I tell you,
Didn't somebody take him under the wing and then convince him to go to Harvard or whatever? And
I am
all that?
sure.
one
That
story.
wouldn't have happened.
highly unlikely that it would have happened. Yeah.
So maybe about 4 years from start
I would
to
say
finish.
4 years start
The
to finish,
pandemic had some.
including the
it
pandemic.
had some-
I will also say that was an extraordinarily punishing and inhumane
Yeah.
work schedule because of the delays of the pandemic. I really didn't get any wiggle room
Of course.
when the actual work took longer.
Did a
So-
publisher jump, well, once you were ready with a manuscript, something that was sort of semi-ready, or talk to me about that was there a market? I guess the point is, this is, because in some audiences, this would be a controversial subject, given our politics in America that are very, very volatile, left to right, without too much Mayor McClellan getting too much into politics. I'm just curious about, were publishing houses interested in this? How much did you have to sell it?
So with a nonfiction book with the major houses, and it was really important that I already had a best-selling book under my belt.
You had already had
right?
that.
So I'd had that. I could prove that I could do an ambitious book, so on and so forth. And so I was able to go to publishers with a proposal. I will say the agent I worked with really put me through my paces. So it was like a 70, 80 page proposal, right, with annotations and all this stuff to be like, this is really possible. And then, I mean, that was when we went to them with it in 2019. So I didn't write the whole thing, right? I just had the proposal.
You had the proposal.
And then,
Fill it out.
yeah, so and that's how it works with
That's
most
how it works
nonfiction
generally.
books for the big trade publishers. So you do that. And yeah, and I had immediately 3 major publishers very interested in it. And the deal I got is very significant. Like I had to take out a loan because of the pandemic, but I
Sure.
was able to just do this.
But you knew it would be a literary home run.
No, and I will say.
Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth.
Well, also, I've gotten some nice like news media coverage. Most books are sold through book reviews.
She's
and
being modest.
No, I'm not. I'm not.
Okay, okay.
And we have not gotten a single national review. And I have pitched 4 essays to national opinion
Okay.
type things, all of which have initially accepted it
Sure.
and then turned it down. And the first couple of times that I got this response, it was like a non-response. It was like, well, it's a very broad brush, or it raises a lot of questions. These are things editors say when they don't want to tell you what's wrong with it.
Right.
And then the third place was the editor said, well, there's a lot of discomfort with this idea of quantifying.
Yeah, how do you come at the number?
So I'm getting some news media attention, but all the normal ways that books become known to readers and booksellers, that's not happening.
Okay, all right.
So-
I looked at it at another way, but you've lifted up maybe some, I take a step back and look at that. But I think it has had a great deal of public relation attention in the general sense. But I
Yes.
think, but reviews, yeah, that might be another thing. I've only got 2 more questions, and I promise to open it up to y'all. That number might expand based on Tracy's responses. But this is in an effort to sort of bring it back home to southeastern Michigan, to southern Oakland County, to some extent Detroit. My family was, my paternal grandparents were part of the Great Migration that brings African Americans from the South, and whites as well, but certainly African Americans from the South, to Detroit in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. One of the first homes they had was in one of Oak Park's neighboring communities, Royal Oak Township, a couple miles south of us, which was, for the most part, certainly in the 1950s, a supermajority African American enclave. And Oak Park, which was a very new city, founded technically in 1947, Mayor McClellan, as you know, was largely white and became largely Jewish at some point. African American migration patterns, particularly in southeastern Michigan, the African American population follows the Jewish population throughout Old Black Bottom on the Lower East Side to the Old West Side, the Central High School and Northwestern High School communities in Detroit. And then ultimately here, by the 1980s, Southfield and Oak Park. It's sort of a given a historical sort of setup for this question. I'm curious. You were very young. You did not. Like as you pointed out, your time in Oak Park. You were very young and probably don't have many remembrances of it. But you did talk about what you learned about the Ferndale experience. The Royal Oak Township experience was sort of really interesting. An African American community that had its own school district, not necessarily by choice, but by race discrimination in housing. In 1963, there was a famous march here in Oak Park proper that pushed back against race discrimination in housing. The Detroit branch NAACP was part of that. Jewish organizations were part of that, and also Protestant people of Protestant faith, Catholics and the Protestants, were part of that. So it sort of, I guess the lead to the question is, this is sort of an interesting area, even north of 8 Mile, not less to speak about south of 8 Mile in Detroit. These 2 or 3 square miles, Mayor McClellan, as you know, have a history of great communication and an organization of allies to push back against race discrimination. But there was race discrimination carried out here. What have you learned in your research about one of your early homes, Oak Park, Michigan, and the environs immediately surrounding?
Well, I think for me, in addition to the specifics of the Ferndale case, right, which to me was mind-blowing, like I knew nothing about that. I also say my mom's family's from Pontiac. I was born in Pontiac, like 3 generations, 4 generations deep there. Never heard anything about the bombings or about the Black Legion or all these sort of very violent, sort of racist things that were happening. But for me, like digging through the case files for the Ferndale stuff, so I was looking at a lot of like Oak Park and Ferndale school files that were at the Michigan Library in Lansing. Yeah. And there's like an interview that state officials did with a woman named Anna Thomas, who was like a black woman in her 90s, so I believe had lived in Royal Oak Township and then was in Ferndale, who recalled for these investigators that in the 20s, white mothers had come to her and asked her to sign a petition to create a segregated district. And Anna, I mean, this was so impressive, so she's just telling the story, and she was just like, well, thank you very much, I'll take a look at it. And she was like, I'm not signing that damn thing. And she organized like other black mothers as well as like white mothers to sort of come with her, because there was some deadline meeting, right, where they were supposed to come and bring the petition. And so she like organized a cabal to like, I mean, that's my language. She organizes a group to go and be like, we're not signing this, like blah, blah, blah. Because, you know, the district at the time in Ferndale was saying like, oh, nobody ever knew, this is all accidental, this is just housing. And Anna Thomas is just like, well, they were trying to do it on purpose back in the 20s, so I don't know what y'all are doing now. But, you know, for me, just sort of being like, that's how deep this stuff goes. And then that my parents and grandparents didn't think it was worth telling me about it, right? So that then I come up as a kid being told that I'm colorblind, right? And I have I mean, I'm growing up in Holly, which is like 95% white. I have no way to sort of know which way is up. And then I'm supposed to go out in the world and be decent without having any idea like what this place has actually done to people.
Yeah. And so you learn about Ferndale, Royal Oak Township, and what I might not have said about Royal Oak Township, not only was a large section of it an African American community by the 1950s, my paternal grandparents lived there as one of their early homes here, but they also had their own school district, the George Washington Carver School District. And so that speaks to some of your earlier points about how the role that education and discrimination within the education system, the discrimination within federal government programs like the GI Bill played in building up just this section of southeastern Michigan. I appreciate your candor. I do want to open it up now for comments and or questions. I don't think we have a mic, so it's really just a show of hands. We'll recognize you and look forward to this portion of the exchange.
And I know we have quite a bit of knowledge in the room too.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I
I know
wanted to give
Mayor,
that time.
and we have Franny Shepherd Bates, which your grandfather was the mayor for a long time? Yeah.
Very good,
Right.
very good.
And then I don't know anybody else on site, but that doesn't mean you're not important, so like.
Well, it might be, Fran, it might be the old situation many of us will remember from our adolescent days. Many people might want to get on the dance floor, but nobody wants to be the first person to dance. Fran, why don't you tell me about your family's engagement in Ferndale?
Oh, Ferndale, not so much, but my grandfather
Okay, I'm
was
sorry,
a-
maybe I missed it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm theater people, but thank you.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so my grandfather, Dave Shepherd, was on the city council in Oak Park for
Oak Park,
years.
okay.
He was the mayor. Dave Shepherd Park is named for him.
Okay, very good.
My mother was known as the mayor incest. And yeah, that's my,
Yeah. So give us a timeline. Give us some timelines of their experience as leaders in Oak Park.
I wish I knew exactly, but it was when my mom was a kid, so it was in the
Right.
60s. Do you know?
Well, and I think one thing that for me that was also surprising is I didn't know anything about the blockbusting case in Oak Park, right? That, you know, I came up as a reporter in New York, so I sort of understood, blockbusting is this thing that was happening in New York, but it was like extremely prevalent in Oak Park, so much so that there was like there was a ban on for sale signs, which your grandfather, I think, had suggested, right, or like oversaw the suggestion of. So the thing was, right, is that these profiteering realtors would come in,
Blockbusting.
right, and they would like scare like
There's a-
anxious white people
there's a black
and be like, you
woman
know, a
growing
black
up."
family moved in down the block, you want to sell? And what they would do is they would sort of partner up, so they would convince white people to sell low, and then they would sell high to black families that were moving in, right? So it creates, we talk so much about race and racism as like a personal failing or like you're a mean person or a bigot, which certainly happens, but often there's this real question of resources and profit. And I think also for me, reading the coverage of the school district stuff actually in Pontiac was really clear about this, because there's quite a lot of sort of historic record on that. Like, black families were very, very clear. They weren't looking to go to school with white people. They wanted to go to schools with
equality.
resources.
They want equality. Yeah.
Right? And that the difference in quality is really astonishing from a modern perspective.
And it was the same thing in Detroit.
Yeah.
It was in many communities. In fact, what history shows us is that while integration was a sort of social formula for equality, there were many people, particularly in the African American community, that didn't necessarily want their kids to be bused 30 or 40 miles. What they wanted was equality in resources, and they realized that that was not happening. Even in the 1963 march here in Oak Park that I pointed out, the NAACP had various positions at various times, but certainly at that time, and this was more about housing than it was about education, it was just about equity and resources. They realized that in Royal Oak Township, there were substandard housing resources there. They certainly knew in points in Detroit that there were disparated resources there. What they wanted at the end of the day was equality. And what we learned, and I think this is an American experience, not one that's specific to the African American experience. If you are a working class family, and if you're someone who had gone to school, maybe got drafted, if you're a man, got drafted in the war, one of the ways that you could help to build generational wealth, at least the first way to do that, was to be able to buy a home. Mm-hmm. And that was thought to be, that was golden. Even if you had other opportunities after that time, maybe you buy multiple homes, rent out homes, all of that, home ownership was huge. And so what's really sort of interesting about our southeastern Michigan set of communities, many of them, most of them anyway, is that I know it's certainly an experience in Detroit. In Detroit, it was the fourth largest city in America in 1940, fourth largest city in America. Only New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia had more people than Detroit before folks started to move out west to California. And we had more single detached homes in Detroit than most places in America. Even today, we had 1.8 million people in Detroit. We only have a third of that now in Detroit proper, a little bit more than 600,000. Detroit is so large at 139 square miles. You could fit the entire Manhattan Island, the city of Boston, the city of San Francisco, and have a lot of room left over. Now, you've lived in New York. I mean, these are population dense San Francisco's western, but they're population dense cities. So they're not large in terms of geography, but they are large in terms of people. The only reason why I make that point is one of the disparate, you point this out excellently, Tracy, in the book, is the lack of access of home ownership for people of color, particularly African Americans, it's still a challenge 100 years after the Great Migration. And that has had its effect not only in that generational wealth, but education, because school districts are built on budgets too, government budgets too, and boundaries as well. I interviewed a young woman a senior, a glorious senior who grew up first in Royal Oak Township, and she pointed out how they grew up in that part, in Royal Oak Township, ended up moving on the north end in Detroit, and got bused throughout their 12 years of their K-12 education because of the whims of largely a white and dominantly male school board that found ways to change boundaries, to keep black people out of majority white neighborhoods for decades and decades and decades. That sets the community behind. Mayor McClellan.
In 1941, the Burwood Wall.
Yeah, just a couple miles south of it.
In 1941, they built the Burwood Wall in the 8 Mile and Wyoming area.
Mm-hmm.
It was built by a white real estate developer to separate his housing project for white residents from the adjacent African American neighborhood. It was federal policy Not,
FDR policy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt policy, arguably one of the most liberal presidents in American history. That happened during his presidency.
Yeah.
What they told that white developer is, Mayor McClellan, is we will not fund the federal government. We will not fund, we have a policy that will not allow for us to fund your project for an integrated, racially integrated community. But if somehow somebody built a wall that separated this largely black community east of Burwood from the development that you want to do west of Burwood, we might find a way to give you some dough. The Burwood Wall still sits there for people that don't know. It's a 6 foot tall wall. It's about a mile from 8 Mile to just north of 7 Mile. It was built in 1941, as Mayor McClellan pointed out. It's one, I do history bus tours all the time. It's one of the sites we go to all the time. It's one of, Tracy, one of the visible illustrations of race discrimination in this region, and it's just 2 miles south of us.
Yeah, I love your concept of white bonus. The term white privilege, I can't deal with it. I can't. White privilege has so many connotations that
No.
don't apply, and the way you talk class plus. I didn't grow up in Michigan, but I got my first job teaching at Southfield High School as it was beginning to integrate. So I lived in Oak Park, and then I moved out to raise my kids, and when I found myself single and house shopping again, I came back home to Oak Park. But because I wanted to be in an interesting community. But when I've looked and people talk about reparations and like people get all, well, I didn't do that. When you talk about 1619, reparations are overwhelming. If you talk about what our government did in the last 50 years, you can make a case that we ought to be responsible for the sins of our parents. Maybe not for our great-great-great-great-grandparents, but we ought to be able to take that into account. And so I love the concept because it makes it recent, obvious, personal, without being, oh, you have a bad attitude.
Thank you. I worked hard on it.
And so I really appreciate the concept.
Thanks.
And then, in terms of one of my favorite anecdotes, I was sitting in the back seat when my daughter is having her driver's test. And this is Farmington Hills. And I taught like 4-year-old Sunday school with the woman who's giving her the driving test. And so she leans back while she's supposed to be watching my daughter drive and asks me what I think about the quality of Harrison High School, and because she picked up her daughter and she saw all the black kids hanging out by the gym. And I said, you know, I don't see a problem. I went through a high school that integrated, and you know, but by the gym is where all the jocks hang out. If you want to see the white kids, you pick up where you're supposed to at the upper level, and it's not, you know. And she said, yeah, my husband would just say maybe we should sell while we still can. And at that point, my daughter goes, and I'm like, oh well, you better watch her, you know. But it was like I didn't expect this. I thought, you know, I was there for the football because my son was up top.
Right.
I did not. I just slapped in the face with it because we don't see it.
Yeah, and I think that's something, I think that's sort of like wink, wink, nod, nod conversation that white people will have with each other doesn't kick in really until you're in like your 30s is when I remember I started having people say these things to me where I would be like, well, I'm not trying to cause trouble at my, like I had a Walmart job, right, when I was working on the first book in Belleville, which was an integrated staff. And there was this woman I worked with who kept saying these like increasingly xenophobic and racist things. And I'm like, how do I deal with like Sue over here? Because like she's my coworker, so I'm not really responsible for her. But also like, I don't really appreciate her continuing to like make these comments to me about like, as if we have a shared understanding about things in the world. And she also, right, to me, was very sweet also, right? Because like by the time I got to the end of that job, I was really burnt out on the Walmart job, and I had gotten a bad attitude, and I totally just like didn't go to work and didn't tell them I was not coming, because I was like, whatever, it's Walmart, right? But like Sue like made the manager call and make sure I was okay, right? Like she was like worried for me, and I was like, well, that is a very nice racist lady. But I think, now I have, particularly having worked on this book, like I'm getting better, I think, at sort of being like, I'm not going to let that stuff stand when it comes up. And I'm just sort of like, well, what do you mean about that? Could you explain more? And just sort of, that usually gets people at least to not ask me those things again.
We want to go a few more minutes with public comment, and I'm going to go to you, ma'am, in one quick second, just some housekeeping. We definitely want to take in more reflection and conversation. We do want to provide for some time before we need to exit from here, certainly by 7:45. I want Tracy to sell and sign some of these books, and so we want to provide for some time for that. So we'll go to about 7:15 or so before we need to really sort of exit the building at 7:45. Ma'am, in the back, there you go. What do you have for us?
Hi. I just want to I have a question, but I want to make some comments first. Mm-hmm. I work with a guy, and we're talking about school integration, and he was talking to me. He said, "Oh, you went to that school?" I said, "Yeah, I went to Osborne." And Osborne, back in the day, it was a segregated school. And so he told me about one day that him and his brother, who was a police officer, he said it was one of the greatest days of his life. I said, well, what happened? He said his brother woke him up, a police officer, and told him to come with him. So he's telling the story, and he's telling about the Molotov cocktails. They were cracking heads and all of this thing and shake. I said, well, Mark, I got a different picture of that story than you do, because they were trying to integrate Osborne, and Caucasian people stopped them at 7 Mile and Mound, and they were throwing Molotov cocktails. They had sticks and stones, and they were rocking buses and everything. I remember that because my mother.
What timeline was this, ma'am? The 70s? Or
in the 70s, in early 70s. Because my mother, she went up there to pick up she was fighting through the crowd to get my brother out of there because, and this is actually a news story as well. But I said, well, I got a different picture of that day than you did. He said, what? I said, you were attacking people who were just trying to go to school. And he said to me, well, I was just doing what my big brother told me to do. And his big brother was a police officer. So the police were consenting to this too. And then I have another guy whom I like, we still exchange Christmas cards. He told me that one day he stole a car and he was drunk. And he drove it through a Kroger. Drove the car through Kroger's. I said, how can you work here? You have to not be a felon to work here. He said, well, my buddy's dad was a sheriff, and he told me not to do it again. And then a lady whom I love, I was telling her about in a shopping center, and how the cashier, I'm there first, but a Caucasian woman comes up, and she waits on her. And she's the lady that, she's a friend of mine, she's Caucasian. She said, that would never happen to me. And I said, you're right. That would never happen to you. None of these people believe in the white bonus. None of these people believe in white privilege. They believe that there is no discrimination. So when, I see the white bonus, and I heard this lady say she doesn't believe in white privilege, there's a privilege and there's a bonus to being white, but you have to talk to people and share your experiences with them to let them know that what you're experiencing Everybody doesn't get that. Everybody doesn't get to drive through a Kroger. Everybody doesn't get to be chosen first, even though you weren't first. And everybody doesn't get to go and crack heads and think this is the best day of their life. You know, but you have to, and I had this conversation with them because I like them. I like them. They're racist. I like them. You know, but I like them because, you know, they just grew up in a way, because I heard you say something about your dad. That's how he grew up. So he doesn't think about that. That's the way that he grew up. And these people, they don't think about it because everyone around them supports this idea of white bonus, white privilege.
I'm curious before we go, and we're going to continue the conversation, but I do want to interject just for a question to Tracy. You did speak to it a little bit. White bonus was a new term to me. I'm familiar with white privilege. Did you struggle with terminology? Did you think about the white privilege? How does the word bonus come in if you didn't?
Yeah, I mean, I came up with bonus. It's not another, I mean, I did a copyright search, right? This isn't a commonly used term otherwise.
So part of it is
right.
the business proposal of it.
Well, and also just being like, well, do people already talk about this? And
Okay.
it's not really, I think maybe it was in like one academic paper or something that I'd seen. And I wanted something that would get at it being concrete and being something that you didn't earn, right? Because I think it's not just that I mean, I know that white people get taught to talk about this as if we don't know, but I think there's a lot that we do know that we're trained to pretend we don't know.
Gotcha.
Right? And I think that with folks who are like, what? I just like got to drive through the Kroger, doesn't like, we understand more than we are conscious of, I think, about how that stuff works. And it's important, I think, in personal relationships to have patience with folks that you love and have that exchange with them. I also think that when you're having a broader social conversation, just be like, we just need to start being honest about this stuff, right? I mean, something that to me has been really striking is how much I have white folks be like, I never thought about this that way before. Like that white privilege has like a material benefit. That's really interesting, right? Very few black people tell me they haven't ever thought of it.
right. You live it. Right. So we've got at least a couple more comments. Ma'am in the front. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, and thank you so much for your presentation. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. When I was looking at the title of the book, since we're kind of on that part, when I saw the white bonus, and it somehow in my mind it just went to the black pay cut. Because because there's so many instances where, and kind of like you were saying, ma'am, where, and this is in the modern day, where there should have been a promotion or there should have been a person who was qualified, no affirmative action, but should have been in a position. And one of those times, and I'm not going to blame Southeast Michigan because we're Hoosiers, where I was the only person working for the federal government in the state of Indiana in my in the capital city of Indianapolis with all the credentials, including degrees in communication, all the credentials to be the public affairs speaker. But in Indiana, it's not this quiet like this. They just said to me, you will never put your black face in front of our company representing us. They just tell you. So all the subtleties that we have here is really kind of shocking to us because we know right off the bat where we stand. Sure. Another quick thing, I'm just saying I've been privileged to be married to this handsome man here for 42 years, and he just wanted to share just a brief incident that occurs. Well, many occur in our lives that let us know that there's a white bonus.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. True story. We're driving down to French Lick, Indiana. I'm in my car. I have my wife with me, grandson, and his cousin. So we're near our destination. I'm speeding. I'm a Michigander. This I do. So in a small town, it was kind of like 70 miles per hour, And then I was going 70, so I got stopped. The officer came up to me, kind of strange. First- Oh, keep your hands on the wheel. Don't make any sudden movements. Okay.
10 and 12.
One of the ironies is he was very friendly. Talked to him a few minutes. He asked where we were going. French Lake is kind of like a resort place. There's kind of like a casino. It's out in the woods. It's famous because Al Capone liked to hang out there under low profile and gamble and do other stuff. So we have this exchange, and I give him my license, and he said, well, do you know how fast you were going? I said, no. And he said, well, I got to tell you, each little municipality here along I-65 sets its own speed limit. So you kind of don't have a clue as you're driving down there.
Not posted or anything, really.
Okay, so, and I am getting to the end. He takes my data, goes back to his car and everything, and runs me through. He comes back and says, well, I think I'll give you a warning. He goes back again, and he does some more stuff. So he comes back with the warning, and he basically hands me this piece of paper. My wife's in the car, the 2 little kids, we're going to a resort area, and the bottom line is this. He had used data from my history, a little bit here, a little bit there, and basically, when he had to turn that into his office, no one would ever been able to determine who I was.
Yeah.
He made up a fake social, he used one of my former addresses. This is kind of like all kinds of larceny. And so I smiled and went on my way, but when you talk about the white bonus, it occurred to me I had a little cap on. He couldn't, he really couldn't tell what race I was. And I just felt like I was an honorary for about 20 minutes.
For a couple minutes. No, we appreciate that reflection, no doubt about it. We'll take a couple more comments before we'll kind of wrap and go to our next section. Tracy would be so proud to sign your books. Sir, go right ahead.
I'm curious, when you left Holly, how did you deal with culture shock and the real world?
Well, you know, I landed at NYU on scholarship, so I don't know that that's the real world either. Because I knew that private schools existed because there were some kids that I'd gone to school with at Holly that went off to like Baptist school or something, or maybe like Marion in the out in Oakland County. Mm-hmm. I'd never been around really rich kids before, right? Which is most of what NYU was. So it was, for me, it was really wild. But I write in the book, you know, I had a pretty hard time coming up. My mom was really sick when I was growing up. I was her caregiver from about 2nd through 6th grade, and then my father divorced her while she was sick to marry her best friend and get some abuse, and it's complicated, right? So I was just really glad to not be in their house. I actually ended up at NYU very randomly because I'd had some sort of difficult interaction with my dad, I don't know, a week before the deadlines for all the applications. I already sent my applications to University of Michigan, to Northwestern, and a couple of places that were free. This is before applications were mostly free. Yeah. So I would take my big boy waitressing tips and count out $35 to my dad, and he would write the check for the application fee and things like that. But I did good enough on the PSAT that NYU and all these schools were sending me stuff, and I was just like, New York sounds cool, and it's not. They can't make me come home for Thanksgiving. Right, and then also I got a little bit of a geographic affirmative action probably, right? Because I was from a rural low-income district and was a very high PSAT score. I mean, I was salutatorian of my high school and things like that, but it was just very weird. And then to be, I think. And I haven't talked about this a lot yet for the book. One of the things, because of the way I grew up with such a difficult family, is that I really do not have a sense of entitlement to much of anything. So even when I would sort of have racialized missteps with people, I think folks could tell it wasn't out of a sense of superiority or trying to dehumanize folks. I I mean, I was just dumb.
Yeah.
Or ignorant.
It didn't come from a place. Even if you accept, as we close out, get ready to transition into the lobby, this is what I'm curious about. Is sort of the last sort of question and ask for a reflection. It sounds as if, and some of us are more comfortable with the term white privilege, the white bonus term as you defined it. I get it. Do you very much feel? It sounds like you very much feel like you grew up in a family that was comfortable, but not a family of means. Yet you've been in spaces with white people who do come from means, and then you lived in spaces, and you've written about spaces and researched spaces of people of color who may not necessarily be in either one of those categories. Are you sort of in the middle? How do you find some?
I mean, I also have the weirdest financial life, right? Like, I'm a very weird bohemian person. Like,
Yeah.
I have, my income on paper is like 20 to 30 grand most years, but I own a house and I have affordable housing, right? So even though my income is low, my apartment in New York is like a 3-figure rent.
Sure.
Right? So
Which
which is
the way
rent regulated,
That's what
right?
it is out there, yeah. Over
You
there.
know, like, so there's all this weird stuff. So I'm somewhere in the middle, but like really easily, if I don't keep myself together, like could very quickly fall into actual poverty. I've had some stints of being, actually pretty poor.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think part of what made this book possible for me to do is that my whole adult life, I've really gone up and down the class ladder and been in very different racial composition spaces.
Yeah.
So like when I was at NYU, right, that's a wealthy, somewhat right, they had some DEI type stuff happening, like trying to have a diverse student body. It's in New York, right? But then the way I was paying for my share of tuition was I both worked at a public high school through an AmeriCorps program, so I'm with like working class New York City public school students, so Black, brown, and Asian. Anybody who has real means is going to the private schools in New York. So these are, I was like working with a Dominican kid who literally had just moved to the States like the last month and like was working at a bodega 8 hours a day after school, right? Working with those folks. And then I also got a job, and I write about this is part of my bonus, with like a 1% wealthy family that had a 5,000 square foot loft in Soho, a house in Connecticut. The kids had been to 6 continents, 7. I mean, they like went on a private yacht cruise to the Galapagos with their dad, type of stuff, right? And so I would have days, right, where I went through the entire American class structure, right, in like 12 hours, and was sort of learning to navigate in those spaces and figuring out where I fit, and also what I wanted, right? Like I will say, I do really appreciate fine design. So if money was no object, I would have some nice stuff in my house.
Okay.
But because I worked for this rich family, but I'm just like, I don't actually need that stuff. Like what I care about is just having sort of a stable, safe life with meaning and good food.
Yeah,
right?
well, that's always important.
And I'm like, and as long as I can get that together.
Yeah, that's half the battle.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Tracy McMillan. Tracy is so happy at this time. We'll go into the lobby area for our last 20 or 30 minutes together. We do have to exit the building by 7:45. Or Mayor McClellan will write us a huge, no. Or
get a ticket.
Our city council will write us a huge ticket. No, but so happy that so many people came out. I'm so proud of her and her work, and I hope that you are too. The line is already starting, so you better get out there. Thank you so much.